The Chalke History Festival special series on history with Jackson. So hello and welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast. Today we welcome Sarah Liscoe to the podcast for one of our Chalke History Festival special series here on History of Jackson. How you doing, Sarah?
Fine, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
No worries at all. No, we've got a really interesting episode lined up today on historical sailmaking. We've been having a chat beforehand and I was absolutely transfixed on some of the information you've given me because I've just never, ever considered it. But firstly, I want to ask you, what inspires you to become a sailmaker?
Well, I wanted to be a sailmaker for a long, long time. I used to sail. I used to teach sailing at the age of 14. I was one of the youngest sailing instructors, dinghy sailing instructors in this country. And I just happened to go to a sailmaker's one day to take the sails, and I walked into the sail loft and just went, wow, I want to be here. Unfortunately, 1986, I said I wanted to be a sailmaker, and they said you can't be a sailmaker because you are a woman, even in 1986. So I took offence to that and then went and did a bit of historical referencing and found out the various legislations that meant that I could, because there was equal opportunities. So I was probably one of the first sailmakers, female sailmakers as well. That is someone that cuts and makes sails as opposed to just sews them. Lots of women have been employed throughout the years for sewing sails, and they're known as seamstresses. But I wanted to actually be cutting and designing and making, which is what put me apart. And I've basically annoyed people along the way as much as possible to get to where I want. Being a woman in a man's world has always been really, really hard, but it's also been very, very forgiving and also very rewarding. Now I'm on this historical journey, it's even more rewarding.
And I can see that you really, really enjoy your job. Now, what is it like being in that workshop, making sails, but also doing the living history aspect of it and teaching people about this skill?
For a long time, I've been on my own in my own workshop, sort of minding my own business and going out and working with customers. And the modern, making sails, covers, boom covers, spray tents, spray covers, all sorts of bits and pieces like that. But I've always had this artistic streak through me as well. So I've done a lot of design work. So, for example, the buggies you see, I can't think what they're called off the top of my head, but the buggies that you see that the old generation get around in, there's one that was called the Booster buggy. It was one of the first ones out, and they wanted a waterproof cover, so they came to me and I designed one. And interestingly, 30 years on, there's still the same key points in that cover that I still see from back when I started. So I've done a lot of one-off design work for big business, but also for the police force, etc. And that's kind of kept me my artistic juices flowing, for want of a better word, alongside the really quite mundane world of just doing, sewing and designing. But the main thing I love is going out to see the people that I'm working for. And the one thing I've always done is made sure that, okay, so you want a spray hood, but let's just look at that spray hood. I want to watch you go in and out of your boat. How much do you have to bend down? What about maybe you want to sit and just hide? So maybe we can just bring it back a little bit. So everything I ever make for a boat is always slightly tailored to that person. They've got to live with it. I don't. So let's make it the best that we can for them. So my artisticness has always come out in my work rather than making something 10 times. I get bored with that. I can't do it. But my son, who occasionally works for me, he'll do all the boring stuff because I can't. Then moving through, I started to do English Civil War reenactment. And I was a pikeman and I went on the field and thoroughly enjoyed it. But my body was starting to fail me. It's tough being a pikeman. And I started to do living history. And I started to be a dairymaid. And I didn't like A, being dressed up as a woman, and B, having to remember things, having to remember how you do things. And I suddenly thought, well, when I worked for Lucas Sales in Portsmouth, I learned all the traditional skills of sailmaking that you don't really use every day. But I was taught them, and I remember various times when Wednesday afternoon was always a half day, or the apprentices were encouraged to stay because all the old sailmakers would come in and they'd sit and they'd have a cup of tea and they'd do bits and pieces around they'd sit and talk and you'd listen to stories. And if you dared and actually went up to them and said, I'm not sure how to do this, they would always show you a much better way of doing it than anyone else I ever had. So it was always worthwhile going to speak to the old folks. Some of them were 90, 80 and 90 years old, but they were still able to come in one afternoon a week and just do a little bit. And I wish now that I'd spent more time with them. But that kind of inspired me, that I was intrigued by what they're doing and I'm in their world. But actually being out just members of public, they also were really interested. It's an old skill that's been lost. As I said to you earlier in the chat we did, sailmakers used to be much like you'd go past down the road and you'd see garage after garage and mechanic after mechanic. It was a bit like that with sailmakers because they were the main point of refuge when you needed your sail being fixed. So you've gone from thousands and thousands of sailmakers, even up to 100 years ago, down to 4 or 5 that still do the traditional work. There are more, obviously, that do the more modern stuff, but they're much more reliant on work being outsourced to China, for example. So you're losing those skills. There's the youngsters these days, they don't want to come in and learn those skills. And so my way, as I'm getting on a little bit now, I'm really noticing that actually the skills I had learned, the skills I've now developed again, if I don't pass them on to someone, if I don't show as many people as I can, then they're going to be lost. And at some point, they're going to be wanted to be found again. Sailmaking was traditionally a skill that was handed down from family, to father, to son, to brothers. In Chatham Dockyard, there's an amazing wall where they've got all the people, I can't remember the date, but there's all the people that worked in the dockyard, and there are 48 sailmakers listed on the board. And every single one of them, the surname there's like 5 of one surname, 4 of the next surname, 8 of one surname. So it's clearly a family. If you're a sailmaker, if your father's a sailmaker, you become a sailmaker. And that's been lost along the way. So my ultimate aim is to find at least one person where I can actually teach these skills to and feel, right, that's good. I've at least passed them on to someone. And along the way, I have, even just by interacting with people in reenactment. So when I'm at a reenactment, my whole setup is of a 17th century, either on board ship or I do as a travelling sailmaker, because there would have been sailmakers travelling around, particularly travelling inland to work on some of the river work, and also windmills. People forget that windmills also need sails. So there's that element that we can also talk about, being a travelling sailmaker. But the main thing people are really, really interested in is the tools that I use, because they are very simple wooden tools on the whole, but they can produce so much from just those. And even now, when I'm working on my modern stuff, I always get my old tools out to use because I'm so used to using them. They work better than anything that's modern.
And looking at the Heritage Crafts website, they call this skill, this craft, endangered.
Exactly.
And you breaking down, going from 48 people on that board to family lines, just in that area, making that skill, to now you having to look for someone to pass this knowledge down to, is really highlights just how important it is to preserve these skills. But when you're talking about the history of this sailmaking, what was the industry like when it was at its peak? You've mentioned the sails of the engines, they were like petrol stations all over the place. What was the industry like?
I think it's difficult to say when the peak of the sailmaking industry was, because sails obviously go back to the nether regions. We've got evidence of pampas grass being used for sails, being woven into sails. Obviously, we've got the wool from the Viking sails. It wasn't knitted as most people think it was, honest. So you've got a whole list. When you come to the 1400s, when there was a lot of exploration done, the Portuguese were very good. They managed to work out different shapes of their sails to allow them to not just go downwind, to actually be able to sail closer to the wind. So that, as you can see on one of my ships behind, you have different shapes of sails. And the Portuguese developed this, and then closely followed by the Spanish, which is why the Spanish And the Portuguese were so good at going around and finding new lands before they then had various different fights, and it was won and lost in various different battles. But it's difficult to say where the best time of sailmakers were. Chatham Dockyard, as we spoke about, is from 1600s right the way through to, I think they said 1987, the sail loft shut down. So they would have seen a complete fluctuation. And their sail and colour loft that they have at Chatham is huge. And there would have been up to 100 sailmakers in that one place. So if you take that as an incident, as an instance, that gives you a good idea of how many sailmakers were needed to fashion the dockyard. But the dockyard would only have been somewhere where they would come together and perhaps be repaired. From the dockyard, you'd also have all the satellite sailmakers. So if we come back to Portsmouth, I said earlier about Lucas Sails. I worked for Lucas Sails. Lucas Sails was set up because the Portsmouth dockyard sail loft couldn't cope with making all the sails for their ships themselves. So they had to start to have satellite sailmakers all the way around. At the highlight, which would be sort of the early 1800s, there were 30 sail lofts in Gosport and all around Portsmouth, all supplied to the dockyard, which is, in my mind, just phenomenal. It's such a big thing. So much so that the dockyard actually produced a book, which I can't remember. It's The Art of Sailmaking, and I can't remember who the writer was off the top of my head. But that was basically a big document, and every sail loft would have one. And I remember seeing that book as well. Lucas Sails, a very, very old version, probably one of the first ones, because they had to all adhere to the same standard as what would be in the dockyard, and that then became the standard of sailmaking. Whereas before, the smaller around the ports, it would have just been historically, well, my dad taught me this and his dad taught him that. So the dockyards, or the Navy, British Navy, was very key in making a standard for sailmaking. But you still get around the country and across in Ireland and also across the world these little nuances, which is quite interesting. If I post something on Facebook and the sailmaker from America will say, "Oh no, that's not how you do it. That's definitely," and I say, "Well, you've got to remember it's come from a whole line of heritage first before it gets to being a standard." And I find that's the politer way of putting it, that we are all entitled to our own way of making it. We all know the basics, and it doesn't have to be written in stone, only if it goes to the dockyard.
And it's really interesting to see that standardization kind of pull through within that answer. I found it really interesting you were talking about different types of sails. I think a lot of us have this idea of a ship with sails possibly having like 18, 20 different sails, but there's different types of boats. You've got two boats behind you, one with two sails and one with God knows how many. Where does that difference start? How does that difference actually begin?
So if you think back to your traditional Viking boat, it has one mast, it has a spar that goes across it, and it has a stripy, generally red and white sail that all it can do is billow in the wind, and generally they can go downwind. But if they want to go upwind or anywhere else other than downwind, they have to row. And the typical Viking boat has lots and lots of oars. I can't remember how many they have, but they have a lot of oars because that's the only other way of propulsion for them, and the tide, which we spoke about earlier. But then, as I said, go back to the Portuguese. The ships were a lot smaller. Excuse me. Ships were generally much smaller, and they were used for like skirting backwards and forwards across. So from France to England wouldn't be a particularly big boat, may only be about 40 foot, and therefore the mast isn't particularly big, but it would have had one mast with 1 to 2 square sails, which is typical. It would have also had at the back a triangular sail called a lantine, and then the foresails, which are generally triangle. And all of those sails work together. If you want to sail towards the wind, you'd use your triangular sails because they're able to be pulled in. But that often makes the ship go sideways, so you have got to calculate against that as well. And your downwind stuff will be with the square sail. So each sail has its own job. You also get to the sails that go in between. and they're made of a lighter material, they're for catching the lightest winds. But if you look at my blue boat that's there, which has got the two sails, that's obviously a modern boat. It's evolved into this sleek machine that's just got the two sails there. But it also has a very, very long keel, which you probably can't see. Everything has an effort, and everything has something else that happens to the boat as well. So I said about the sails, they'll make the boat go forward, but it will also go sideways as well. So you have to counter that on the same idea. So sails have all got different jobs, and they're all different weights as well, which people don't realise. The sails nearest the boat are made of a much heavier material because they stay up the longest. So if you're going into rough weather, you start taking the sails down from the top and from the outsides. It's getting a bit windier, let's take another sail down or furl another sail as we go along. And the rest of it is you're just down to one sail. You always have to have one sail up because for the rudder to work, you need to be moving through the water. So that's why the one sail, the main course, is always, it's almost like cardboard. It's probably 1/4 of an inch thick on some of these big sailing boats. It's ridiculously heavy as well, but it has to stay up to allow the boat to have some steerage. Doesn't always put you in the right direction though.
Is the craft in making each of those sails, if you're making something that's a 1/4 of an inch thick as opposed to making a really lighter sail, is that a different skill or a different way of making it?
Generally, it's all the same stitches. Every sail will have a rope around the edge of it because the cloth, the canvas, is not necessarily stronger. So as a tent, if you think of a tent, any tent, it gets to a point where it doesn't get any bigger because you can't really go any further with the cloth. And it's flat-sided. So the last thing you want is a tent to catch the wind. So with sails, even one of those sails is probably 10 times the size of your tent. So that puts it in perspective. It's also got a slight curve to each seam as you're making it, or certainly overall the shape has a curve into it so that it actually catches the wind to help the boat move forward. But that cloth on its own, if you put an eyelet in the corner and attached a rope, it would rip out straight away because the force of the wind in that sail is too much. So all the way around the outside of a sail, you have to sew rope onto it. So it's completely rope edged. Every sail is rope edged. That's kind of how you know it's a sail or whether it's a tent. And then the rope is actually what forms the eyes at the end that the ropes are attached to, so the boat is then sailed. So the rope is the structure and the cloth catches the wind. It's probably the very simplest way of doing that. And the skills to do that. So when you go to the sail is made in panels. The cloth comes from, it's 26 inches if it's navy, but prior to that, cloth had different sizes. It depended where in the world you were. So generally in this area, it was about 21 inches wide. If you go further north, it's narrow up to about 15 inches. And further south, it gets wider to up to about 23, 24 inches. And that's because the wood that the loom was made from, if it was not very dense, it would snap as it was being made. So they got to a point where the cloth varied just because of the loom and how it was made. But the point being is that you've got 21 inches of cloth, but you need to cover 30 foot of sail. So 21 lots all the way along. So each one of those has to be sewn. So often when you see ships and on paintings or on those, you see all these lines. You think, well, what are those lines? Well, they are actually the seams where it's doubled over. So you've got to seam it, each of those, and that takes a lot of time. And then you've got to put extra patches on the corners or where the sails rub on various different things. And then you've got to put eyelets in the corner. I mean, nowadays you just make a hole and hit it and you've got a brass eyelet, for example. But then every single eye has to be hand sewn, hand ringed. And then you've got the rope work you've got to put all the way around it. So a sailmaker is very good at rope work and rigging as well as the sewing of the sails because the whole thing works together. So the skill and time that there is in that is immense. But you wouldn't ever really work on your own. I work on my own, and I recently made a 2 metre by 2 metre sail, hand sewn all the way through, and that took me 48 hours to make from start to finish. That's just a relatively small sail, but it gives you an idea. If you turn that into the topsail of the Victory, which is the only sail that, and the oldest sail that anyone ever has, which is just huge. I've calculated that it would take me 7.5 years working every day, 12 hours a day, to make that topsail on my own for the Victory, which is scary in itself. Normally, you wouldn't work on your own. If you're seaming, then you'd have 4 or 5 sailmakers in a row, all with their benches, all in a row, and you would sew your piece, which was from one arm length to the other arm length, and basically you'd sew that bit, and you'd all do that together, and then the sail would be passed down a typical conveyor belt of sewing, and you start again. So you would get through seam after seam after seam very quickly, working as a team, and then the sail then would go off to another area of the sail loft where it would be roped, so that in a big sail loft you'd have different skills in different areas of the loft. So it's a proper factory, for want of a better word. Someone would be cutting, someone would be seaming, someone would be finishing and rope work. In the smaller sail lofts, it would be down to 1 or 2 people, and they would do everything. So the skills change depending on where you are and where you're working.
And it's just incredible the Victories, sail and how long that would take you personally to make without a team. That's just absolutely mind-boggling that it would
Yeah.
take that much time. But then when these sails are up, how long do they last on the ships? Because I think that's another part of sail making we might not consider when we're looking at these grand boats like the Victory and the Mary Rose.
It says in the art of sailmaking, it actually states that 100 gun ship of the line. So we're talking about 1800s, late 1700s into the early 1800s. 100 gun ship of the line, that their sails would last them, because they're up all the time and they're sailing around and fighting, 9 months. So you've just spent all that time making sails, and 9 months is all you've got to work with. That's mainly because the material is obviously flax. At this time, the sailcloth is flax. Flax was grown in this country prolifically, and one of the best sailcloth manufacturers was the coca cloth down in Yeovil, which was favoured by the dockyard. And in just a little add on there, the coca cloth from Yeovil was actually the cloth used on the USS Constitution, because the captain didn't want their cotton that was grown everywhere in America. He wanted the linen, the flax cloth of England. So even the USS Constitution has, or had originally, British sailcloth on it, which I think is quite funny. But the sailcloth obviously was the biggest part of it, and it had to be made.
So what type of materials are they using? But then in terms of those tools, you mentioned you're using wooden tools. What type of tools are you using for that as well?
Flax has been traditionally, a little anecdote is that up until about 1700s, the best sailcloth, and I love the fact that it was the best sailcloth, everyone wanted it, came from France. But the British got quite good at using that sailcloth to make very good sails, and then beating the French in sailing, because they were able to outsail them for various things. And the king at the time got so annoyed that the British were using French sailcloth to outsail them, that he banned the export of sailcloth from France to England, which is why the British then went and, shall we say, asked a couple of French and Belgian sailcloth weavers to come across to the British Isles and start making it there, because the flax was the best way of making the cloth. But of course, it's a grass. It starts out as a grass. It's a plant. It has to have an awful lot of work done to make it into a very, very fine thread. But that thread is the best thing. It's very flexible. It doesn't absorb salt, which obviously is a good thing to have if you're anywhere near a salty sea. But it tends to break down from the inside out. So when you go back and we're thinking about how long these sails last, just the whole movement of it all the time means that it actually breaks down at a molecular value, which is why they tended not to last particularly long. But you would never just have a whole suit of sails and wait for them all to die and then put a new set up. even on board, the sail makers that are on board will be still making sails down below when the ship's manoeuvring around, because they can still work in a relatively small space of time. So they're always working on a sail that they're either repairing or making new. So there was a constant rotation of the sails that were there. But in America, they were using cotton because obviously that was easy. It was being grown. Why would you transport something thousands of miles when you don't need to? And the properties of for sails for cotton and flax are fairly similar. The cotton tends to go harder when it gets wet, which means that it doesn't hold quite such a good shape, and the flax will still stay quite flexible. So that's the difference. But the cotton will absorb salt. So one of the things that's really a real problem with cotton sails is that every time it rains, you would have to hang your sails out just to get soaked in the rain, but then you'd have to dry them again. So there's a lot more work looking after cotton sails than there were flax sails. As long as they were dried and stowed away, they would last probably longer than the cotton. But you use what you've got around you. But then, of course, Britain was trading very heavily with America. America wanted to get rid of their excess cotton, so the cotton started to come across to England and be used for sails. But the captains and masters of the ships didn't like it being used at all. And there's actually legislation where flax was banned in the use of sail for merchants, because ultimately they wanted the trade with America. So to keep the trade going with America, they had to stop the production in this country, which was a bit of a shame. But you could still go to Ireland and get flax sails, because flax and linen, obviously in Ireland have a lot of up until now they're still weaving linen over there. So you could go to Ireland and have your sails made there, but you'd have to have them made with patches already made in them, so that when you came back and went to customs, they'd go, "Oh, you got a new set of sails." No, 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 not these old things. Look, they've got patches here and there and everywhere. And it was, I suppose, for 20, 30 years you could get away with that. But the flax sails that had been in use for thousands and thousands of years were basically eked out by the cotton being used. And nowadays, cotton sails, of course, were used particularly with the America's Cup. America's Cup, most of the big ships there, they were all cotton sails, and they do very well. Nowadays, we have modern cloth, which you can see on my ship up there. It's much whiter. It's made from nylon, and it has very good properties. It lasts a lot longer. It tends to not go mouldy. But one of the main things, and something I'm very, very passionate about, is the fact that the flax and the cotton will always rot down and therefore go back to the earth, which is much more sustainable than the plastic boats we make and the plastic sails we make. So if I put my other hat on, which is the eco-friendly, I would always go towards any natural product being used, because it's much more diverse. It's much more able to be used and then reused and reused in something else, and then finally it will always rot back to the earth. And I think that's a lesson for the future. I think that one.
I think that's a really nice consideration to have when you're sail making. Now, I think there's a question there about the cotton and the flax. Really, you're mentioning that sailors preferred, or British sailors preferred, the flax. Even the captain of the Constitution preferred the flax. What was the sailing difference between using either one of them? I know you mentioned the properties of cotton being a lot more care there. What's the difference in how it's like to sail?
If I'm honest, I don't know. I can only surmise. I've sailed with cotton sails. They do get hard, and they will lose their shape, and then they get saggy very quickly. And that's only from my own experience of them. This isn't anything that historically I found out. It's not really written, but certainly looking at the Victory sail, which, let's face it, is it's a fair few hundred years old, and that was found by accident. It had been when they were clearing out. It was found 100 years after the victory, after the Battle of Trafalgar, and someone recognised it as, oh, that must be the Victory, because it had a name, I can't think what it is, on the corner, the sailmaker's name and the cloth manufacturer's name. And it was then stenciled with Victory topsail on the top of it, ready for the centenary. So 100 years after, it was hung and showed off to everyone. And there's a lot of it missing because there's various gun holes in it, but also because the mast come down, there was a big rip down the centre. But being able to be close and up personal with this cloth, which I was able to do, was fascinating because I could really look at the structure of that flax and how it is. And it was just far better than anything I'd used when I've been working for Lucas Sales, when we were making cotton sails. It's hard to explain, but unless if you're a bit of a geek, but just looking at the structure and the pattern and the way it's been woven, but also how it's also worn. So it's clearly been painted with something, which often sails were painted with ochre, so different ochres from the land. Obviously, you'd use the ochre that was closest to where you lived. You wouldn't go and transport it, and you use linseed oil, and you'd mix it into a paint, and you paint on. The ochre would then go into all the small little holes of the weave, which then helps with it catching more wind. And the linseed oil would give it some sort of, or fish oil, that was the other one they used, would give it some sort of water repellent as well. And you could see in the Victory sail that it had clearly been covered in some sort of painting, some sort of way to waterproof it. But how that had worn off, but also just looking at the structure of the rope, and that the rope had been done, all those years away, and the stitching and each of the individual parts was just, I found fascinating. But it did make me think that even now, that sail, you can still fold it. You can still, not that you'd fold it into a crease, but you can still, you can still move it around. It's still flexible. It's not hard. And I think that is fascinating, that even though it's been coated, even though it used to have a lot of dirt on it and all sorts of patches that we don't know what they were, but it's still a flexible, it's still recognizable as a sail. And if I was given it and repaired it, terrible thing to say, but it could be hung up. And it was hung up last in the 80s, I think it was. No, it was 90s, apologies. It was hung up in the 90s, albeit in its fragile state. But I still think that's a credit to the sailmakers and the cloth makers, that all those years back, it's still there. That's the oldest piece of cloth we have. Other than the Mary Rose, of course. The Mary Rose, when the Mary Rose sank, she sank with her masts up and all her sails up. And within 24 hours, the sails they'd been diving down, and they took all the sails off and they were repurposed. But what they did find in the Mary Rose when she was risen was that there were folded sails that were in one of the stores on the orlop deck. And I was able to go and see some of that, the material that's left there, which was just also fascinating. But also to look at the structure of how that cloth is made up, and that it's different to what the Victory cloth was. And I think that's just a case of 200 years previous, it was more open weave. But of course, we don't know how much being underwater for 400 years has actually impacted it, and the amount of silt that would have gone through it. So the Victory sail, for a historical sailmate to look at, is a really good base of, well, this is what it was like, this is the standard, this is the cloth, this is what we still do, and all the stitching and everything, that was still what I do now.
It's really awesome to see you still using those skills, and they're still using the same methods that were used then. And interesting to hear the development between Mary Rose and Victory. But then, I've got a final fun question for you, Sarah, as we do for everyone who comes on the podcast. Have you got, and I know we were discussing this slightly before we started recording, have you got a favourite set of movies where, looking at the sails, you're like, yep, that's done right?
There's two. Our Flag Means Death, which is stupidly funny if you actually follow it. But they've also, I look at the sails and I can watch the rest of the movie because the sails don't irritate me. And the first three of Pirates of the Caribbean, that's all fine, and it's all the rigging's correct, and they're fine. But anything else drives me up the wall. Literally can't sit and watch something if the sails are not right. But I think that's just when you end up being a bit of a nerd and a bit of a so into the historical side of things, and things, you just think, why didn't you ask? But there we go.
You often do think, well, a historical consultant is not that hard to get, don't you?
Exactly. Yeah. Admittedly, there's not many historical sailmakers out there, and I've kind of set myself up into this position initially by accident. But the more I'm learning, the more I'm really getting involved with it, and it's doing good. It's it's really starting to put it out there, not just the practical side, which is where I first came into this whole journey, but also the historical side. And I'm learning, and everything else just seems to, as we said earlier, everything overlaps, because everything in history involved a ship somewhere along the line, and therefore that ship had to have sails. And so, it's integral into every piece of history all the way through. Even with the Romans, you think about the Romans, well, how did they get it? They must have sailed. They didn't paddle all the way over, did they? So so when you start putting the headline of sails and then into putting that into history, there's a link everywhere, and I'm fascinated with the whole lot of it.
Obviously, we've heard how passionate and how knowledgeable you are about this subject in this podcast. But people are going to be able to learn more from you at Chalke History Festival this year. So what are you going to be doing at Chalke?
Chalke, I'm really looking forward to. Mildly scared, but I'm also looking forward to it. And so every day, twice a day, there will be a session where people come up and I will do a talk. There are 3 episodes to discover. There's various different topics, so each day will be different. It will not be the same talk each day, because I'll get bored, so I'll just change it each day anyway. But it also means that people can keep coming backwards and forwards. They don't just think, oh, I've seen that, and go away. It will change. It will be interactive as well. People will be learning how to do knots. There are people that can actually come and put a palm on and do some stitching with me if they want to. That absolutely love that. As I said earlier, if I can get the skills out there and even teach people how to do a few skills, then that's where I'm being meant to go. But I'm also will be doing a talk on the stage, which is momentarily forgotten which stage it is I'm on, and that will be sales through time. So it'll be a little bit like what we've done, but we'll be starting at the beginning and think about sales. That will also be a part where the audience participation will be expected, but I'll leave that one as a hidden thing, which I'm sure everyone will be like, oh dear, but they don't have to go on stage or anything. But the whole thing I'm trying to do is to get people to think about sales as being a part of history. Once you've started to learn about sales, as I said, once you can see the intricacies of how they go together, and once you've got your hands on and actually having a go, and folding a sale is the other thing we'll do, a big sale that we able to fold up and down, just feel the weight, the physical weight of, and it's a small one, of how that is, of with the children, they can come and do like a show and tell, so they can pick up something and then ask what it is, and then they can see how they use it. So it really is, I do like it to be very interactive and hands-on, so that people can actually, and smells as well, lots of smells. So smelling the oakum and the beeswax and the ropes and all those different smells will also integral, because we need to use all of our senses to be able to learn, and we don't all learn out of a book. I don't. If someone talks at me, I'm like, and it's gone out my head. I'm a very 3D learner, so I try and put that out there. So there's a bit for everyone, really. Even the ones that are bored, they'll still be doing knots in the corner.
No, I can't wait to see what you've got going on at Chalke. But you're not bringing any fish oil to
No,
waterproof
I
your
did
paint
think
on.
about it. I'll bring the linseed oil instead. But that's another thing. There'll be chance for people. You reminded me. Thank you for that. That there will be a chance for people to actually sort of like have a go at painting onto the cloth. They can paint their own designs in the cloth, with using the traditional the way of doing it. So that's just something else to do.
Oh, that's going to be awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming on, Sarah, and I
You're
can't wait to
welcome.
see you at Chalke.
Thank you very much.